Hello, I'm Jamie Sanchez, and I can't eat anymore.
I'm Lauren Fates, and I refuse to pay money to be scared.
Are you ready for the beat?
I'm ready for the beat. Welcome back, everybody, to another week of the Bebop Beat. This episode we're about to discuss is the favorite of a lot of fans, and I'm not a huge fan of the horror genre. I don't like being scared, as I said in the opening, so I don't feel like I'm going to be much use this time. Jamie, I think this is one of your favorites, though?
As friend to many horror-loving fans, they will be very disappointed in me if I don't take the lead on this one, so I hope I do right by them.
So, okay, quickly, top 3 favorite horror movies, and then we'll introduce our guest.
You put me on the spot here, Lauren. Moon, for sure. That's a top pick of mine. The Nightmare on Elm Street series, and third horror film. Jamie, you can do this. Children of the Corn.
So since we had Melody Spivak on talking about Alien, I did go back and revisit Alien, and I am a big fan of that because I can do suspense, I can do sci-fi, but I have very vivid memories from childhood of just being terrified to manually expose myself to anything scary. When I was in the Girl Scouts, we went on a field trip to go haunted house hopping. And this says a lot about my personality. This field trip was completely optional. There was nobody making you go. You didn't have to do it. If you're a scaredy cat like me, you could just stay home. And I was like, I need to prove to myself that I can go and be scared. And I was so nervous, I made myself sick. I gave myself upset stomach and had to leave the line in front of the haunted house to go to the porta potties because I was so ill.
Lauren!
But I had something to prove. This is why we avoid horror in general. I will scare myself sick. So, because I knew I wasn't going to be a real asset this episode, I wanted to bring in a sort of pinch hitter. I'd like to introduce all our listeners to my friend, Symphony Sanders. Symphony is a horror buff, and you may know her from a horror property that is in the podcast sphere, known as Welcome to Night Vale. She also does Good Morning Night Vale, and you may have recently heard her on one of the Jackbox Games. Hello, Symphony.
Hi, Symphony.
Hello. Hi, y'all. How are you?
Doing great. Pleasure to have you here.
I'm turning red because I'm so embarrassed about my childhood Girl Scout story. That's how I'm doing.
That was hilarious. Big ups to you for being so brave to even make yourself sick, to the point of making yourself sick. However, I was the complete opposite. I have loved everything horror for so long. Although when I was a very young child, when the Thriller music video, the Michael Jackson Thriller music video came out, I was a small child and I was very afraid and would run out of the room anytime the song started playing. But now I crave it. I crave the jump scare. I crave being on the edge of my seat. And I actually have also worked with Random Horror Podcast number 9 with Cecil and Jeffrey Craner. So I love vampire movies especially.
You did have time to think about it after I put Jamie on the spot. So do you have a top 3?
Sure. Jamie, I agree with you on the Nightmare on Elm Street series. Freddy Krueger is classic, and it's hard to choose one above the other. I love any sort of series movies, so I also love the Hellraiser movies.
Yeah.
Those are purely... that's such strong horror as well. It's pure, full of gore and scary scenes and, being in hell, basically. And it's very, very scary. And I think a more recent one that I've really enjoyed was It Follows, because it's a little bit more to your liking, where it's a little bit more suspenseful.
I'm going to have to retcon third choice. I think Poltergeist.
Children of the Corn is a classic.
It is.
Oh,
But so is Poltergeist.
You're so right. It's beautiful.
When you talk about going to hell in mysterious places, like, yes, Poltergeist is my jam.
I think one of the reasons suspense works for me so much is I refuse to have questions left unanswered. And so if there is a suspenseful scene or sort of a mystery going on, I will make myself watch the rest of it because I have to have the question answered. I'm not a person who can just turn it off and stop thinking about it. My mother is a voracious Stephen King reader, so clearly I did not take after her. And she used to tell me the plots of the books she was reading, and her just sort of like narrating Stephen King plots to me, I would get so scared. She doesn't know this. I would go into her room and flip to the back of the Stephen King books and just read the last like 10 pages or so because I was like, I have to know how this ends or I'll never stop thinking about it. So I read the back like 20th of a lot of Stephen King.
Oh my gosh.
You, an X-Files fan, you're not a fan of like unresolved questions and storylines.
Right.
Well, the X-Files works for me because it's got the second unresolved question, which is, will they smooch? And that's enough to keep me coming back. I have to know.
Will they smooch? I love it.
They do also. Spoiler alert.
Spoilers.
Yeah,
So-
spoiler alert for X-Files.
It was like 15 years ago.
Lauren, it was fate that we met because me, before I was a big anime fan, I was a huge X-Files nerd, like gigantic. And it was a natural progression into anime. I don't know how.
Maybe there are more people out there, listeners. If you were an X-File before an anime fan, we want to hear from you. Go talk to us at BebopBeat on Twitter.
Maybe that's our next rewatch podcast.
The longest rewatch podcast ever. Are you ready to be my friend for 10 years? Oh my goodness. So anyway, speaking of rewatch podcast, I guess we should talk about what we're actually here to discuss, which is our favorite anime, Cowboy Bebop. The episode today is a bottle episode, as they say, called Toys in the Attic. I mentioned earlier that Toys in the Attic is an Aerosmith reference, keeping with the rock album session titles. And this is just a love letter to a lot of classic sci-fi, as well as a lot of classic horror. But like I said, I wouldn't know.
This episode begins with a familiar line to Star Trek fans. Instead of Captain's Log, we get something like Space Travel Log 0968. And that kind of sets the tone for the entire episode. There's like Star Trek beeps and boops and a red alert and pretty much all of these really great homages to the ship's design and stuff like that. So keep an eye out for that stuff as we talk about this episode. But then we also lead into other homages, such as James Cameron's Aliens and Stanley Kubrick's 2001 Space Odyssey.
The general plot is that something insidious is crawling in the dark, and the Bebop crew is in their normal, downtrodden way. They're starving, they don't have a lot of money, and they're dealing with this in a variety of methods. So Jet and Faye are gambling, Faye is cheating, Jet ends up nude, and I guess that's one way to deal with your lot in life.
His iron codes of honor are not in favor of him today.
You know, I was thinking about this because like we mentioned, Alien and other movies of that ilk, you will see, and like you see in this episode, you see a slice of their life the way it is, right? And, you know, there's joking around, it's not really serious, it's just another day. But what makes this day special is something strange happens, right? And I love that sort of homage to those movies where you're just like, oh, everything's fine. It's just a normal day. And you see the Ein going about his business, just chilling, and, you know, Faye's doing her business and Spike is like being a weirdo. But I I really enjoy that about it, that it really challenges, it really plays into that whole thing, similar to Alien, where you're just like, I'm getting a slice of their life, and then it all goes wrong.
I think we mentioned this either off mic in a previous episode, that this is really an episode that's just the Bebop crew. We get a really good sense of how they all react to each other as roommates. And this episode never brings in a third party like a bounty. In a way, too, the ship becomes its own character in a way it hasn't before, which I really appreciate and we can get to in a little bit later. But you're totally right in that it's just a normal day on the Bebop. It's a little calm because they have no bounty hunting going on. And hey, what are they best at? Cheating each other and and making really crappy food.
Oh yeah, that goes throughout the episode. He's just like disgusted by his own cooking, and I don't know, I don't remember. I watched the rest of the series so long ago. If he cooks that often, or if that is brought up.
Normally, the cook is Jet as sort of the ship's dad. He does most of that labor. And I was surprised to see Spike giving it a whirl this time, especially because they're apparently so low on supplies. If we only had like a couple of mushrooms and a couple of peppers left, I don't know if I'd hand them off to Spike. He reminds me of like if you've ever played the early Sims games and the people with the real low cooking scores, the Sims will just automatically start the kitchen on fire. That's not who you give the food to.
Exactly. And he consistently keeps making that blech sort of like, he's like, well, this is terrible. It's like, okay, well, you just ruined the food that we had.
This whole episode really juxtaposes horror with humor again and again. And that is actually a Bebop trait. We see a lot of humor in various serious times. But this one adds so much levity where it's necessary to make the horror aspects of it more intense.
And similar to horror movies, no one believes that anything is actually going on until it's too late. One person, and similarly to Alien, where one person gets infected or sick or bitten early on, and then the rest of the crew is left trying to figure out, unbelievingly, right? They're unbelieving that anything is even happening. Really, but they know that their crew member has been injured and is now felled. And I just found that so fun that they kind of just played into that horror trope of being like, oh no, until I see it, I won't believe it.
So Symphony, how does this sort of setup for this episode differ from maybe an episode setup in Night Vale? Because when you were talking about this is just an average day, it's super normal, the first thing I thought of for you was that a normal day in Night Vale is very weird. There's like never normal in that program.
Yeah. Night Vale is one of those places where you're never sure what's going to happen, except for when you do know, like when it's street cleaning day or something like that is happening, or it's parade day. You know that there's going to be issues, but you kind of just deal with it. You don't treat anything as if it's different. You're just like, you go with the flow, I think, a little bit more than you would in what we would consider our lives. And I think that's the main difference. But in this episode, I felt like they're more used to dealing with bounty issues or issues that have to do with like someone trying to take something that they want or them trying to get something that someone else has, rather than in Night Vale, where you're just like, well, this thing has destroyed my home now. I have to move on from that. Or my family has been, taken to a cave because they didn't vote correctly. But I did like the strangeness where it comes to the alien. I don't know what we should call it. The little blob
Mutant,
monster.
I guess.
Yes, the mutant. I like that. Yes, the little mutant, and where Ed came in, because Ed was the most Night Valian, I think, of all of the characters. Because they're just like, well, I just accept what's happening, and they go off skipping, living their life, unbothered by the fact that something's biting the rest of the crew.
I think that's actually a really sweet point, because Ed's dream for a really long time was to live on the Bebop, and it was her home. And I think she's a lot more willing to just accept what happens there, because she's still living the dream. It's still exactly the setup she hoped for. So she's willing to put up with a lot. Just like if you live in Night Vale, that's your home. You deal with stuff.
Right.
I also like this idea that Ed is an eldritch horror, and we just didn't know until this episode.
Exactly, because when she is just like gobbling it down, or just like she's skipping through with the goggles on and then somehow loses them, but not in a way when Spike finds them. He thinks she's been abducted, but in truth, she's just gone off to take a nap somewhere. And I think that's the most Night Valian thing I could possibly think of. That during a severe crisis, when the rest of the crew is felled or bitten and laid up, wrapped up, when the dog was wrapped up in the middle, oh my God. I was crying. I was like, poor Ein.
I hate when bad stuff happens to dogs on media.
Me too. It's the worst.
So it takes actually a while for the situation to escalate this far, though. In fact, for a while, there's sort of denial going on the ship. And that, I think, is a very common horror trope as well. You always have these characters who are like, no, we're here at the cabin to have fun. Don't be a baby. It's probably nothing. And it always makes the situation so much worse. Jet goes to the storage room looking for something to cover his nude body with.
And right away, I'm like, don't go in there. Don't do it. What are you doing?
Right.
Don't split up the party, right? Don't go in the dark room. All the hits. And he gets bitten. He hits the red alert, which is, again, very Star Trek. And everyone comes running, which I thought was very good. Like, even though they're all sort of goofing off and they're scamming each other, when the red alert happens, they're there for their friend. Until they see this bite happen, and they just assume it's a rat. And here is another funny moment for me, when Spike almost remembers something and then goes, nope, can't remember, and walks out of the room and basically refuses to think about it anymore. Like, the couple brain cells he had hit together and just did nothing. He's definitely like the jock boy in the horror films, in the teen horror films.
Oh, absolutely.
Big flags for me were, one, Jet enters the unfamiliar storage area way back here, as he says. He doesn't remember there's a fridge. There's some weird elephant trinket, like statuette, floating around towards the end of the episode in the cargo area. Just, it gives me the impression that he bought the Bebop sight unseen, didn't bother to clear out someone's old garbage, and was just kind of like, yep, this is all my stuff now. Who knows what's in here, but who has time to manage it? It kind of gives the ship its own life, in a way.
Exactly. And also, even when that clip where you see his silhouette in the door when it opens is so horror. And like, even though, he's not the perpetrator, he's the person coming in, but it's so ominous, the backlighting of that, something's going to go wrong. And then again, yes, just like you said, Jamie, about the refrigerator that he didn't know was there. What? It's like, oh, buddy, don't go in there. And also, why doesn't anyone listen to the animals? The animals, they know. Ein was like growling, pointing. He's a corgi. What does he know about protecting anyone? But he knew something was wrong. And then they blew it off because they saw one rat. So they automatically assumed it was the rat that did the thing. But it's like, that's not necessarily true. It'd be like if a plastic bag blew by and you're like, well, I guess that must have done it.
Guess it was a bag.
As As a corgi owner myself, I will say that Watson's always on red alert for no reason, and we always just kind of brush it off.
Well, then I wonder, would you trust if Watson started pointing and growling at something where you couldn't see anything? Would you be suspicious?
So, okay, this is a whole
Lauren's
story.
shaking her head. No.
No.
This is a whole story. So Watson is a joint custody corgi, as I will say.
Okay.
I have him 1 month, and my ex has him another, and it's all good terms.
Sure.
But there was literally 1 month when Ryan was like, here's Watson. He got groomed and saw the vet, blah, blah, blah. And I think he's haunted. And I'm like, what? Why do you think our dog is haunted? And he's like, he just stares at things in the distance, growling like cupboards and whatnot. And for like a good month, we were like, he's haunted.
Did he become unhaunted?
Yeah, I think he's okay now.
But wait. He was haunted at your ex's place, not at yours.
There was maybe about a week or two where maybe he was like a little wound up. I don't know what it was, but yeah, just...
Okay, well, I would say that your ex is haunted and your dog is traumatized.
Possibly, yes. This is a whole year ago before lockdown, so fortunately...
That doesn't exactly answer the question, though. Does that mean you would trust Watson or you wouldn't because he's like always haunted and now we just dismiss that and we don't care about it anymore?
I would say if I tell Watson to cool it and he's got like another minute of barking in him, yeah, that's a dog I'll trust. But like if he's just barking because he's bored or like he sees shiny thing, he's got a whiff of something from the kitchen, okay, that's different.
Okay. Well, I think this happens more in horror genre shows than we give credit to. Animals always know. Is your cat staring off in one specific place all the time? Maybe there's a ghost. It usually happens with supernatural things, not so much with alien monster type things, but it happens, and you got to pay attention.
Definitely in the genre, that is always posed as like, they are right, they know first, they have that intuition. And what's extra bad about that is some movies go so far as to let the animal come to harm.
Yeah, I don't like that.
And there's a Twitter account that is specifically dedicated to spoiling whether or not anything bad in a movie happens to an animal, so you don't have to like worry about it. I actually think it's a great service.
No, that's actually beautiful because that's the worst when you're like, no, they hurt the dang dog. Like, that's not right.
In a horror film, if like 200 people die, okay, I'm here to watch that. But if an animal gets hurt, no thank you. I'm leaving. Money back, please.
Well, and that's how I felt with like 30 Days of Night. The sled dogs get kind of unalived by a Renfield. So vampire's helper, but like towards the beginning of the movie, but it's to like keep people from leaving the area. So like sometimes I think evil things target animals to keep people from feeling forewarned, right? But this dog, Ein, he was happy trotting around, but he was on the hunt, I think. And then when he was with Ed just forgot. Or didn't care, was like hanging upside down and then was like, la la la. And then Ein trotted off, right?
She's just in her own world, like pretty much 100% of the time.
I do think this is maybe the first episode where we see that these two characters have bonded and start sort of becoming shown more often as a team. And in hindsight, I don't necessarily know why that is, because if this happened to me, if I were Ein, I don't know if I'd trust Ed so much anymore, but they become really close throughout the series, and I think this is sort of the inaugural episode of that.
I will also give props to Melissa Fahn playing Ed this episode. We get lines such as mysterious beast creature, spooky attack of the horrible alien, and she does such a great job acting whimsical and fun and silly.
It's such a good match between the dub and the sub. I always am fascinated because we watch both for this podcast. The intonation and even some of the specific throatiness in the Japanese voice, Melissa Fon totally nails. I feel like she must have really invested herself in the sub before taking on this role.
Yeah, I wasn't sure, so I watched both as well. Got to delve in extra nerdy types. And I really did enjoy the voice acting in both. But like, I really love when voice actors that are dubbing something really take from the original reading of it, but also bring their own quirkiness or whatever they want to bring to it. And this Ed was just so fun. And every time they spoke, I was just like, oh, this is cute. They have a bit of a like low-key sort of vibe where it's just like, I'm a whimsical sprite that could destroy everything in a second sort of feeling. And I really enjoyed that.
She also knows about like gene sequencing or something like that. She's 12 years old. Come on.
Oh, she's 12? That makes it even more interesting.
It's one of those things where it's like, how do you know what poison toxicology reports look like? I don't understand this.
We've talked about this before, though, how Jet is often assigned like random talents and careers to serve the plot. And the Bebop also has random tech to serve the plot. Like they had this whole bacteria germ matching software that they just busted out like it was no big deal. And the heat vision too, which was another really common trope in horror, like in Predator, busting out the heat vision.
I actually was going to ask you guys, had you seen that? You hadn't seen any of that tech before in any of the episodes?
We've seen them use this analysis machine, particularly in Sympathy for the Devil when they're analyzing the crystal.
But not in this way. And it's really weird to just say it's an analysis machine. It's a big sci-fi swing. It analyzes.
I want one of those. Give me that tech.
It's similar to the tricorder, where the tricorder could basically do everything. It can like scan your body. It can like scan rocks and minerals. It can heal. It could even like heal small things, right? But it couldn't like fix your bones, I guess. But like they could be like, well, your arm is broken, but we'll heal this tissue or something. Like
I forgot about that. It was kind of a Swiss Army knife for sci-fi tech instrument.
Yeah. Well, and even like Doctor Who has his like sonic screwdriver and things like that does an innumerable amount of things. So why not have a thing that can analyze all sorts of media, whether it be plants, animals, minerals, poisons, blood samples, whatever. It's a science machine, baby. Trust it.
I guess the more we talk about it, the more sense it makes, because we already live in a world with the internet.
Right.
And you could Google whatever. You could do a Google image search of a bacteria and information would come up. You could have a gem or a diamond like we had in Sympathy for the Devil and just like Google its traits and someone is probably talking about it. I guess it's not so far-fetched after all.
Yeah, we could Google poisons and like their effects, right? I mean, that's basically what the like poison control. I bet you we could go to their website right now via Google and figure out what we were poisoned with. If it didn't take that long to kill us.
Yeah, we're not going to call the like an ambulance or something. We're just going to start
that costs
Googling
too much money.
Symptoms. It does. That has come up on this podcast before, how in the Cowboy Bebop future, healthcare is still prohibitively expensive. So
wow, capitalism is still around, huh?
Yep.
Unfortunately.
Dang. You'd think we'd figure it out by 2171, right? 2071.
Yep.
Well, if you listen to like the Elon Musk fans of the world, when this is recording, people are talking about Elon a lot again because he's about to be on Saturday Night Live. And a lot of his fanboys sure seem convinced that he's going to have Mars colonized in like 20 years,
Cool.
which yeah, bullshit. No way. But two, if he did, it would have to be at the expense of solving so many other world problems.
Right.
That, like, I guess in an Elon world, we would have colonized Mars, but not fixed healthcare or like solved homelessness, and capitalism would still be around for sure.
Just ship them to Mars, baby. You don't need to fix it. Just shuttle them to Mars. It'll be fine. Then there'll be so much more room.
All humans or just Elon? Because if we just sent Elon, I'd be fine.
Well, him and Grimes and the baby.
You go up there, tell us how it is. We'll be right behind you. We promise.
Yeah, just 14 years back. But doesn't it take like 7 years to get there or something? 9 years or something? It's something ridiculous.
In this show, it takes 68 hours from wherever
I was
the
going to say,
Bebop is.
by current standards, but who knows? When Elon saves us all, maybe it will be so much shorter. I'm being very sarcastic. I really hope it reads. I think Elon's the most obnoxious person in the world. I'm ready for Twitter fights. Let's do it.
Someone called him the Goku of cringe on Twitter, and I thought that was excellent.
Yikes. The Goku of cringe. That's
He's
wild.
still discovering yet unprecedented amounts of cringe-worthy moments here.
Okay, this is becoming way too much dunking on Elon Musk for a Cowboy Bebop podcast. There are lots of really interesting choices made in this episode beyond the technological ones we've already talked about. I think the facial animations and expressions are really on point because we're not relying on action sequences. We're very much relying on feelings and relationships. And I think the people who created this episode were super aware of that. We see lots of cool new sets, new rooms of the Bebop, and there are some fascinating music choices as well.
This episode made a lot of really great audio decisions in terms of the use of silence, droning sounds like the fan above Faye's bath, high-pitched cacophony at the end when things are kind of coming to its climax, and just the very eerie background tracks we hear. One is by a Polish composer known as Penderecki, and that would be Utrenia Part 1, The Entombment of Christ, produced in 1970. And the other one is Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers, which we see with that signature spinning of the refrigerator being flung out into space. We also have the ambient version of a track called The Real Man from the Cowboy Bebop OST Blue. These were just really, really good choices overall. Another really good audio choice made in this episode was to overlay the voice narration of the lessons, to use it as a story mechanic where we've never used it before in the show. The first outsourced audio track is this distressing high-pitched noise that's prevalent in two scenes. First, in the hallway when Spike finds Ein, and then again during Spike's terrible realization. This orchestral piece was created by notable composer Penderecki in the 1970s. Cowboy Bebop uses Utrenia Part 1, The Entombment of Christ, Movement 2, Songs of Praise, and our editor Angela pointed out this fascinating connection. The creators of the show likely chose this piece because it's also very prevalent in The Shining. In particular, we hear it during that famous Here's Johnny scene, among other places. And that's actually sourced from Utrenia Part 2, The Resurrection of Christ, Movement 1, The Gospel. The second outsourced audio track comes from Tchaikovsky's Waltz of the Flowers, when that fridge spins out into the vacuum of space. We also have the ambient version of The Real Man, which is a very noise-forward Batman Beyond-esque track from the Bebop OST Blue. This one has to be in my top 5 all-time favorite Cowboy Bebop songs.
That's awesome. I didn't know that, but now that you mentioned it, that is, first of all, I love The Shining. And that is a super powerful piece of music. I think all the music within this episode was supporting the story, but also like creating that environment of tension, and you felt a bit of that tension released when the refrigerator was floating so beautifully in space, which also made me feel very like 2001 Space Odyssey feelings. But I love that. And I love that the music, I mean, because The Shining was very suspenseful throughout.
They made a lot of graphic choices too that added to the tension. Uses of dark blues and black colors, this monotony of the audio and the emptiness of the ship itself. We see a lot of long hallway shots, especially in the gravitation chamber that spins around the Bebop. And then they're also leveraging this like different visions view of, as Lauren mentioned earlier, the heat radar, but then also this red tone from the creature's perspective when it's scurrying around the ship.
Yes, that point of view every time they went to the creature was very horror. And I loved that feeling of being like, oh, okay, you're the hunter, you know, scurrying around. And so you're getting this uneasy, creepy, crawly. And the sounds that they used for that too were so gross. And it made you feel like icky and like you didn't want to touch anything.
I really appreciate the sound choice they made where Spike was brushing his teeth, and for a split second, they let you, the viewer, think it's the sound of the mutant blob coming. Again, very good horror trope, but also, Spike, why you brush your teeth so gross?
Also, he's super into herbal medicine, which tracks along with his superstitious kind of streak going on. And he tells Jet to drink this green and goopy concoction.
What was that scene with the lizards and the scorpions? Why was the first aid kit packed with stuff like that? And then poor Jet, he's like, don't you have anything else? Isn't there anything else? Why haven't they stopped for Band-Aids? That seems like the type of thing Jet would be on top of, like emergency, while he's out buying his cheap, bad missiles from that previous episode, he should have been buying a first aid kit. Why did they have that stuff?
I want to know how Spike has stayed alive this long on herbal medicine. It doesn't make any sense.
Well, and everything he described was like grosser than the last thing. And poor Jet just kept getting more and more discouraged. I mean, he'd already been swindled out of his clothes and his dignity by Faye. And then to only be like insulted further by his friend giving him a gloppy, disgusting, salamander drink. Like, get out of here. I'd be like, I need new friends.
These are the worst roommates.
They are.
It adds insult to injury. I hadn't thought about it this way, but Spike in an earlier scene is kind of scolding Faye for cheating Jet.
Right.
And Faye defends herself like, that's part of the skill. He should have been able to recognize the cheat. And Spike seems disappointed that she would treat Jet that way. But then he just treats Jet like garbage.
He doesn't even tell Jet that, like, hey, you were fooled. You can get your stuff back. He's just like, whatever, let them work it out. She'll rent his clothes back to him. Wow, that is a decision.
It's very, everyone is their own individual, but we're still a team, but your individual dealings with each other are your own. Like, but we'll come together for one thing, but other than that, you deal with your own issues.
So kind of in the vein of teamwork, we get into a position where everyone is down or missing, except for Spike. And Spike takes it upon himself to be the one to finish off this monster or die. I actually found it quite chilling. He sets the Bebop on an autopilot course to cruise down to Mars and land on Mars once it has gone through the gate. And this very clearly is him saying, I might not make it through this, and I want to make sure the ship goes somewhere and our bodies are found in the event that this breaks bad. And I'm not sure I caught just how dire that was the last time I watched this.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was an ominous sort of thing when the computer when the Bebop was talking and was like, once you set this course, you can't change. It can't be changed. And, those things happen in a lot of sci-fi horror where you're like, this is the set path that we're going on, and it can't be changed. And that someone either isn't going to be there at the end. It sets a very like fight or flight. Like you have to win, triumph, or you are going to completely fail. And it'll end up hurting people because this blob will get off onto the planet. That was my concern. I was like,
yeah, it could.
I was like, you would let that happen?
Just unleash this upon the citizens of Mars. Why don't you, Spike? Good call there. Real adult.
Yes.
So there are just a lot of like quick fire, I think, horror references here. Spike puts on a bunch of ISSP gear, and I think it very intentionally kind of pays homage to the Ghostbusters. Mm-hmm. The backpack look, specifically though the tracker, he just looks like he's wearing a proton pack, but sort of made of junk. And there's a moment where he has a cigarette and he's exhausted and he's leaning against the wall. And that was very Ghostbusters as well. Like Gozer just gives them the business and they all duck behind a pillar and they're just like, oh my God. Very, very Ghostbusters to me. And then the other horror moment or horror trope that really resonated with me was exposed skin or just vulnerable people in general in the presence of the blob. Faye's in the bath, mm-hmm. and her foot is very explicitly hanging out of the bath. And I was like, something's going to grab that foot. Whether we're talking about the monster under the bed, or we're talking about like that lake blob in Creepshow 2, and the people hanging off the raft, like, you don't want to have any appendages of yourself
no
hanging out. So just what were some of the other references you all caught before we get to the end of this adventure?
I mean, I think we've really touched on those, but I honestly, I think some of the sounds that happened, and specifically within the one where she's in the bath and she hears the glop, plop down, and then she looks and she doesn't see anything. And then you see her eyes trail up to where the fan is. And then she dismisses it for herself. But then you see the next time you see her, she believes it and comes into Spike and is like, there's something going on because it bit her too. That whole reckoning moment where the main character, as it were, has to be like, well, now I turn from being a passive, like, if my idiot friend gets bit by something, I don't think of anything. But this person that I consider of higher value, smarter person gets hurt too, or just the number of people, then now I can find the seriousness in the situation and go a-hunting.
In this episode's rewatch, the emphasis of the Bebop being in the vastness of space is far more apparent to me than it had been previously. On previous watch throughs, I was like, oh, look, it's just, the kids in the cabin. Ha ha ha. Really funny. But now it's like, oh, also, the vastness of space is out there to get you. And perhaps it's just me getting older. But I did have some real The Thing vibes on this watch through too. It's just the isolation of the unknown beyond, right? If you leave the safe, comforting space of this ship and you go out there, it's over. And that was really emphasized when Spike pushes the fridge out into space so it can go twirl on forever and ever.
Leaving a glitter trail behind it.
Yeah.
Which was gorgeous.
It looks gorgeous, but the dread I had for him to also fly out into the vastness of space where he can't do like his magic gun trick to fly back into the ship.
Yeah. Another scene of Spike in space without a suit and being fine.
So the trope of the airlock time thing happening. It's like you have to hang on while the vacuum of space is trying to suck you out into space, and then hit that button, and then you have to hold on long enough so that the doors will close and you don't get sucked out into space. And he just barely makes it because he hits his back on the thing. That happens all the time as well.
The background of this episode really, though, is that, hey, watch a bunch of roommates goof around and then also do terrible things to each other, and then also be totally incompetent when a target that's not a bounty comes into their space, right? We find out at the end of this episode that, no, it's just Spike. He can't clean things out of the fridge. Like, what a terrible roommate to have. And his sin is so egregious that it has mutated into a form that will kill them, right? And I believe in the sub, he says, he calls it a Ganymede rock lobster, right? The thing he wanted to eat in, is that the third episode, Lauren?
Yes. Interestingly, though, in the translation I have, which is the Blu-rays, in the dub, he says Ganymede rock lobster, and in my sub translation, he just says a real lobster. And so I found myself wondering if the Ganymede idea was an invention for the dub?
I think it's far more convincing that it's the Ganymede rock lobster, that Spike has happened upon something that could potentially happen to a foreign species that not many people know about, right? Ganymede's only been colonized in the last, say, 40 years. And strange things grow there that they farm. Has anyone left one in the fridge? Is he the first one to discover this? And then does that also mean that down the line, the citizens of Ganymede are just going to be totally boned at some point when all of these things turn into mutant monsters with poison bites?
That just goes to show you that you need to eat your food. Don't waste food. That's the moral of this episode, of this lesson. You know, it's like, don't waste food.
He says as much.
Yeah.
So I'm going to take my biggest, wildest swing, and it's not a hill I'm willing to die on because I'm half joking, but I'm only half joking. I think this episode is a giant metaphor for how Spike is in general, especially concerning much larger issues in his life. If he leaves things unaddressed, they become much worse for him and they harm the people around him who he cares about. Spike has left his whole past in the fridge and it's rotting, and we're going to have to deal with that by the end of the show. I would even wonder if this episode is canonical because in my mind, it's just a big metaphor for like Spike not having the maturity emotionally or otherwise to deal with stuff that's his responsibility. But I think it is canonical. My understanding is it comes back in the manga. But that's my point. Julia even gets fridged for him.
It's interesting, the lessons themes in this episode, because we have the voice narration that we only usually get with the episode previews at the end of every episode. But this one is weaved into the central storytelling mechanics of Toys in the Attic. And Jet's lesson is bounty hunting is freelance work and you'll do what you need to survive so long as it's by your iron codes of honor. Faye's lesson is that deceit is necessary to survive and you shouldn't trust others. Ed says if you see a stranger, follow him. Ed, how are you alive all 13 years of your life? I don't understand this either.
Because they eat anything.
So we're going to go there. Our hero this episode is actually Ed, right? Presumably when Spike passes out, hitting his head and back against the airlock door, everyone's incapacitated, but Ed is sleeping. And the ship finds its way to Mars. They dock, and Ed probably has either figured out how to unpoison them so they're alive after 64 hours of space travel, or more realistically, they all show up in a really bad state on Mars, and she's just kind of like, yeah, I ate the thing. In the dub, she says, oh, pudding. But in the sub, she says manju. And manju is this like sweet bean dessert. And if you look up a picture of manju, you could see how the two look similar, this weird mutant thing and the manju dessert itself. But again, as an Eldritch horror, These things don't matter to her. She'll eat whatever.
Also, I was a little off put, but by how big Ed's mouth got when, speaking of being an eldritch terror, like how big their mouth got when they gobbled up that black goop. Oh, why would you pick it up to eat it? I mean, are you really that hungry? Have we seen Ed to eat whatever before?
No.
Not to this extent.
Okay.
But Ed, to your point about Ed's physicality, Ed is presented as a character who is just in a different ballpark than the others. And so it's not that you're surprised that she does this, but there's no precedent either.
Right. I'm just like, okay, well, it seems to me that Ed, while looking like a young humanish person, is definitely not on the inside, you know?
It's just, and I'm kidding, but it's more defense for my argument that maybe this isn't canon and this is just sort of a fable of sorts about these characters, because that is a really unreal thing for Ed to do. And I truly think this episode reads like everyone dies at the end. The only reason we have to make up a story about what happened on Mars or what Ed did or how this was resolved is because there are more episodes of this anime.
Right.
So we assume they live. But if you showed me this on its own, you were like, this is a movie and it's all there is, 100% I would have told you they were dead.
The title, the ending card too, is like the end, period.
Right.
And the preview for the next episode is Ed going on about how they all died. Amen. It's her show now. She runs the show.
Right. But then Spike's voice comes in and is like, right, and just like, get out of here.
To add some flavor here about the Cowboy Bebop merchandise and such, there is a small album called Cowgirl Ed. You can get it. It has a few tracks on there. It comes packaged with the CD box set. And so that exists. There's also a couple of illustrations of Ed as a cowgirl. So the illustrator's like, gotta draw her like this. And lastly, the show almost didn't air its second half. This may actually be an allusion to when Cowboy Bebop itself was taken off the air, because the time at which it was broadcasted the show was seen a little too violent. And Bandai Toys wasn't having it anymore, and they're just kind of like, well, I guess we're done. We don't want to pay for this anymore. And then Bandai Entertainment swooped in and picked up the show and brought it to its conclusion.
They did all die. It
happened, Lauren.
See? So this was the end. The rest is all a fever dream.
I just want to give a shout out before we go to our guest from last week, Bo Billingsley. I laughed out loud at his performance, just the little noises he was making when they were guessing the different diseases he could have, like cholera, Ebola, and he's just going, huh? Over and over. And I was just imagining our new friend Bo in the booth doing that over and over.
Michiko Yokote wrote this episode and several other episodes from Cowboy Bebop, one being Ballad of Fallen Angels. And when we talked to Marshall about that episode, I made a very clear statement, put my flag there, that there are no unnecessary scenes in that episode. Everything all works to build upon the tension or the drama, and you really can't cut the fat because there is none to be cut. This episode is the exact same. Just very well crafted, well shaped. You get a lot of emotional storytelling. You get this connection to their lives as roommates on the ship in the vastness of space in between jobs. But then you also get this really stellar terror narrative built out of nothing, essentially. It's like, this is in my top 5 easily. It may actually be my favorite episode.
I can see why. It's a really fun episode. There are obviously elements of horror, but like we've said previously, it also brings in a tremendous amount of humor. Even when it's at its darkest, we find that Spike is really the cause of it all. And I find that so hilarious because he wants to be the hero, but he ends up also being the cause.
I like that framing. I hadn't considered that. That none of this would be a problem if he didn't goof. If he actually just cleaned the fridge and ate the thing.
Right. The fridge that no one else knew that was there except for him.
What were your thoughts on this episode, Lauren? I know you don't like horror, but did this do anything for you?
I really like it as an exploration of relationships. You get to see what everybody is like for a short time when there's not an emergency, there's not a job. Jet talks about how this is what freelancing is like and how when the money's there, it's exciting. But when it's not, you're self-employed and you just sort of have to make do with what you have. And when they're out floating in space, they can't just pull over to a restaurant or land somewhere and take a hike in a nature park. The Bebop and each other's company is like all they have. And I found it very interesting to see how they value that in some ways and just how they also super don't. Like, Faye will scam the people who are helping her eat.
Everyone's really in their element. I mean, Spike even runs back into the room he poisoned to grab his smokes. Like,
after realizing that he couldn't light his cigarette because he dropped his lighter, but then he tries to light it with a flamethrower and then burns the whole thing down. That scene to me was also from being super high stakes, him escaping this room full of like toxic smoke that he's trapped this animal or creature in, but he's willing to run back in there just for his own pleasure. That's
his death wish streak, I think. We really see him in high gear. You know, he could be flung out into the vastness of space. He could be, you know, eaten by this weird mutant creature at any time. By the way, he totally nails the theory on this being a mutant creature to begin with, and that it's secreting some kind of unknown form of poison. Just like, he's on the money this entire episode, and he just thinks it's going to be an average day. Like, we're going to be bored out of our minds, but no, he's suiting up. He's going for it. It's another reason to shoot some bullets into a thing.
Into a problem he created himself.
Yes.
Oh no, the consequences of my own actions.
Is that the new title of the show? It's no longer the Spike Spiegel sad show. It's just like Spike Spiegel's comeuppance.
The consequences of Spike's own actions. So, Symphony, for our friends at home who may be familiar with you from Night Vale, how do you think Tamika Flynn might handle this monster?
Honestly, I think she would probably go about it the same way that Spike does, with lots of flips and weaponry being thrust at this, whatever you have on hand. Definitely the flamethrower. That was clutch. I think that would be amazing, but I think there would be a few more axes thrown. Personally.
At the end of the episode, we see them all floating with things surrounding them. And I think with Tamika, it would be like weapons, but maybe also books.
Definitely books.
Because reading is important.
It's fundamental, Lauren. It's fundamental.
Symphony, before we started recording, I was telling the anecdote about how I was playing Jackbox and I heard your voice and was so excited because my friend was on something famous. So in addition to that gig, where can our listeners hear you and what are you up to?
Well, every 2 weeks you can hear me and my friends, Hal Lublin and Meg Bashwinter, discuss episodes of Welcome to Night Vale on our show, Good Morning Night Vale, which is available anywhere you can find your podcasts. And I was actually recently on an episode of Welcome to Night Vale, but we also have live shows that are coming up. We have one of my favorite shows, All Hail, coming up very soon as a live performance that's pay what you can. You can check that out at welcometonightvale.com/live. But also, you can find me anywhere the internet exists. I am on pretty much every social media platform at Symphony Sanders. That's me, forever and always.
Well, I'm really glad we got to hang out with you today as our horror pinch hitter. I had more references up my sleeve than I thought I would.
Don't
nothing compared to the Queen.
Don't discount yourself, though, Lauren. You know more than you think.
It's a real pleasure, Symphony. I had a lot of fun today, so thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, that's the end, dear listeners, for this episode of the Bebop Beat. You can join us next week when we discuss the novels.
Yes, this is going to be all about the printed publications centered on Cowboy Bebop. I'm borrowing the manga from a friend of mine. Very exciting. So you don't actually have to watch an episode of the anime next week. I know we are generally a rewatch podcast, so if you're watching along with us, take a break from the animation and just hang out with us for a bottle episode. It'll be a lot like when we talked to Steve Conti about the music.
Can't wait to dust off my volumes.
See you there. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to the Bebop Beat. If you like our show, please rate us on Apple or wherever you find your podcasts. Find us on Instagram and Twitter at Bebop Beat. Our email address is bebopbeatpodcast@gmail.com.
The Bebop Beat is hosted and produced by Jamie Sanchez and Lauren Fates. Our editor and associate producer is Angela Geis. Our logo and art assets are by Kat Janda.
Okay, I need off mic. I need to see that
yes.
dog.
I will gladly.
Oh, what a babe.
Yeah, he has a tail.